3 hammer strikes, a sealed coffin, and a woman still breathing inside. Essie Dunbar was only 30 years old when she was declared dead. But 3 days later, she came out of the grave. What happened that morning in Blackville, South Carolina, defies everything we think we know about life and death. A town in shock, a woman buried alive, and a return no one was prepared to witness. If you're into true stories that feel like horror movies, hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's a medical mistake that made a woman wake up inside her own coffin. The sun hadn't even broken over the sky of Blackville when Essie Dunbar felt her body begin to fail. It was August of 1915, and the suffocating heat of South Carolina made the air feel like a wet blanket draped over the town. She tried to get out of bed, but a sharp pain pierced her chest like an invisible dagger. Raffo times she collapsed to the floor. Raffo, her breath shallow. Raffo, her eyes rolling back. And then, silence. The town's doctor arrived shortly after, an old man with trembling hands and a haste that didn't match the gravity of the moment. He examined Essie, searched for a pulse, listened for a heartbeat, or tried to. After just a few minutes, he declared, "She's dead." The news spread like wildfire. A young woman, full of life, snatched from the world without warning. But there was one detail that hurried everything. Essie's sister lived in a neighboring town and wouldn't arrive until the next day. Even so, preparations for the burial began that same afternoon. At the time, bodies weren't preserved for days like they are now. The heat accelerated decomposition, and tradition dictated that burials happen quickly. So despite the protests of a few neighbors, they decided to bury Essie the following morning. Her sister wouldn't be there. Grief mixed with urgency. Is IK cool? And no one dared question the doctor's diagnosis. At dawn the next day, the coffin was carried into the small-town church. Simple, made of light wood, it looked like a cocoon of peace. But inside, Essie might still have been fighting, maybe even trying to scream. 3 pastors offered prayers. Their words of comfort failed to reach the stunned faces of those gathered. It was as if no one could understand how someone so full of life could simply die. But then, just as the coffin was being placed over the grave ready to be lowered, a wagon arrived, kicking up dust in its wake. It was Essie's sister. She jumped off in tears, stumbling over her own feet, begging the men, "Please, open the coffin. I have to see her. I never got to say goodbye." There was hesitation. Whispers, glances exchanged between the pastors and the gravediggers, but in the end, they gave in. One of them grabbed a crowbar and, with some effort, removed the nails, sealing the lid shut. What happened next, no one was prepared for. Because when the coffin was opened, Essie Dunbar sat up. Yes, she sat up. Her face pale, her eyes still cloudy, but alive. Her sister screamed. The pastors stepped back. Some of the mourners fainted. Others ran, convinced they had just seen a ghost. Or worse, a curse. But Essie was alive, disoriented, confused, but alive. She had been buried alive. The town plunged into a paralyzing silence. No one knew what to say, what to think, what to feel. And as everyone struggled to understand how this could have happened, a new question hung in the thick morning air. If she's alive now, when exactly was she dead? The metallic sound of the hammer striking the nail still echoed in the ears of those who were there. 3 nails, 1 on each side, 1 in the center, 1 in the center. 3 firm blows to seal the fate of a woman who hadn't yet died. When Essie Dunbar sat up inside that coffin, reality shattered like broken glass. The town watched, stunned, as a supposedly dead body came back to life before their very eyes. But one question burned hotter than all the others. How did this happen? The doctor who had examined her vanished for days. Some said he had a breakdown. Others claimed he fled, afraid of being lynched. What's certain is that he never gave an explanation, nor took responsibility for the mistake. At the time, medicine was limited. Accurate equipment was rare, especially in rural towns like Blackville. The absence of a heartbeat or visible breath, combined with Essie's sudden collapse, was enough to declare her dead. But what if she had been in a coma, or in a state of catalepsy, where the body appears dead, but the mind remains aware? There are records of similar cases. People buried alive by mistake, victims of rushed diagnoses. But in 1915, no one in Blackville knew those terms. They only saw what looked impossible: a dead woman, alive. And the most haunting detail? The coffin had been sealed shut, by force, not with fancy locks, not due to a manufacturing error, but with nails driven in by the hands of men of faith. 3 strikes that sealed a premature death, and if not for Essie's sister arriving just in time, she would have been buried alive, still breathing. Some said that when the coffin was opened, they saw scratch marks on the inside of the lid. Others swore there were none, that she had simply woken up at the right moment. Those details were never confirmed, and maybe they never will be. But the town was never the same again. Blackville was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where faces were familiar and names were passed down through generations. And suddenly, that sense of safety was shattered by an ancient fear. If even death can fail, what else is uncertain? After the initial shock, Essie was taken back home. Still weak, she could barely remember what had happened. Her last memory was a sharp pain in her chest and the ceiling spinning above her. Then, just darkness. She didn't remember the funeral, didn't know she'd been declared dead, much less that she had been buried. When she found out days later, her face went completely still. No tears, no screams, just a whispered sentence. So I was down there. Essie's home became both a sanctuary and a source of rumors. Some came to see the miracle. Others came trying to figure out if she was really who she said she was. But many began to avoid her. Because in the minds of many townsfolk, no one comes back from a coffin by accident. And the cruelest part? It wasn't death that hurt Essie the most. It was how the world reacted when she came back. For weeks, the town of Blackville seemed to live under a veil. Conversations would go quiet when Essie walked by. Mothers pulled their children to the other side of the street. And the eyes would never meet hers. Because Essie was no longer just a young woman from town. She was the woman who came back from the grave. Some called her a miracle, others a curse. But the look she received was always the same. Fear. The local churches split in their beliefs. One claimed that God had brought Essie back for a divine purpose. Another whispered that she had been spared by the devil. No one knew what to believe. But one thing was certain. Blackville never saw her the same again. People aren't afraid of death. They're afraid of what death might leave behind. And Essie's return was an open wound no one could close. The story spread faster than the railroad tracks. She was laughing inside the coffin. There were scratch marks on the lid. She spoke in strange voices when she woke up. None of these versions were ever proven. But truth doesn't always survive when legend is more interesting. What is known for certain is this. Essie fell ill, was declared dead, buried, and then woke up. And that alone was enough to make her a living legend. She tried to return to normal life, go to the market, walk the streets. But with every step, she felt the weight of an invisible cross, the burden of the supernatural, even though she was simply a victim of medicine. And worse, she began to doubt her own reality. Did I really die? She once asked her sister. Or did I never fully come back? Nights became harder. Essie said she had nightmares, suffocating dreams where she woke up trapped, gasping for air, screaming, but no one could hear. She also began to hear things. The sound of dirt hitting wood, whispers in her room, a repetitive echo which she described like this. It's like they're hammering something again. Essie had no history of hallucinations. She was never the type to make things up. But now, something in her had changed. Maybe it wasn't just her body that came out of the grave. Maybe a part of her soul stayed down there. People continued to avoid her. The doctor, when he returned to town, never looked her in the eye again. The church that once welcomed her now left her sitting in the back pews. She was alive, but never fully accepted. A survivor, but never celebrated. Little by little, Essie began to disappear. Not from the map, but from social life. She vanished from parties, from church services, from family gatherings. She started living in the shadows, as if she were paying the price for coming back. And the question that echoed in the minds of the townsfolk was the same one that haunted hers. Should she have come back? Time passed. But for Essie Dunbar, time didn't heal. It healed wrong. The mark of her death wasn't on her body. It was in the eyes of others. And in her own. She no longer had fevers, no more pain. Clinically, she was healthy, but something in her seemed broken, as if she had crossed a boundary the living were never meant to cross. In Blackville, people began using a different phrase to describe her. They no longer said, Essie, the woman who came back. They said, the one death refused. And there was something unsettling in that phrase. Because deep down, everyone knew. When death makes a mistake, it comes back to fix it. Essie lived in silence. She read the Bible with sunken eyes. She walked slowly, as if stepping on sacred or cursed ground. She no longer spoke of her nightmares, but she never said they had stopped either. The only thing that seemed constant was the cemetery. Yes, she began visiting it often. Always alone. Always at the same time, dusk. She would stand there, staring at her own grave. The tomb where her name was already etched, where her headstone had been placed with flowers and tears before she rose from it. Some townspeople said she would stand there for hours, just staring. Others swore they heard her speaking to someone or something, but no one ever dared get close enough to find out. Children grew afraid of her house. They said it was haunted. Some would knock on her windows as a dare, challenging each other. But they always ran when the lights turned on by themselves. Or so they claimed. Little by little, Essie became a local legend. Yes, she was alive, but socially she had been buried all over again. And that's when something even more disturbing happened. One afternoon, a traveler arrived in town. A medical professor from North Carolina. He had heard the story. He wanted to meet her, study her, ask questions. He went to her house, was received politely, and after hours of conversation, he left in total silence. He never spoke of what she said, never published a word. But he did leave one sentence behind. In a letter sent days later to a university colleague. She was alive, but her eyes had seen things no human being should ever see. After that, no one else tried to study her or understand her. And time, which had once seemed frozen, began to move again. Essie grew old. Yes, she lived many years after that episode. Decades, in fact. But she never married. Never had children. Never left Blackville. She remained there, near the grave where she had once been buried. It was as if she were waiting for death, but not with fear, with reverence, and maybe with an unspoken promise. Because once, when a neighbor asked if she still feared dying, she gave an answer that was remembered forever. I don't fear death, but I do fear that this time it'll take all of me. Decades passed since that stifling morning in 1915, and yet Essie Dunbar's grave kept receiving flowers. Not from family, not from friends, but from strangers, people who traveled to Blackville just to see, with their own eyes, the place where a woman was buried alive and came back. The grave is still there today, with a simple headstone, worn down by time, but what's engraved on it chills those who pass by. Essie Dunbar, 1889 to 1962, buried alive, survived, died at 72. The inscription is real. The story is too, but to this day, no one knows exactly what happened. Some say Essie had an epileptic seizure. Others believe she fell into a deep coma. Some scholars point to catalepsy, a rare condition where a person loses all muscle movement and appears dead. But the truth is, there's no definitive explanation. Because deep down, what haunts us most about this case isn't the medical mistake. It's what came after. The trauma, the stigma, the isolation. Essie didn't return to life as it was before. She came back to a place where science had failed her, and where society failed her even more. And that leads us to a deeper question. How many people throughout history were buried alive, with no one arriving in time to open the coffin? In past centuries, that fear was real. That's why coffins had bells attached to strings, in case the dead woke up. That's why graves were watched for nights on end. That's why the phrase, "saved by the bell," carried real weight. But Essie had no bell, no second chance by design. She had luck, and a determined sister. And if her story survives to this day, it's because she represents more than a mistake. She represents the dark side of medicine, where haste kills, where certainty is sometimes just a well-dressed assumption, and she represents the darker side of society. That judges, that excludes, that turns victims into myths, and then leaves them behind. Essie truly died in 1962, this time with no surprises, no coffin reopened, no screams of horror. But until her final day, she lived with an invisible scar, one not on the skin, but in time itself, in the way her life was told, distorted, and feared. And today, as we look back, only one question really matters. How many times will science repeat this mistake before it learns to listen to the silences that still breathe? Essie Dunbar was buried alive by mistake. But the most painful part of her story isn't the error. It's what they did to her after she came back. And what if it were you in that coffin, screaming inside, while the world above thought it was already too late? Essie's story reminds us that medicine saves, but it also fails. And not everyone who comes back from death is welcomed the way they should be. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. Because there are still medical mysteries out there, as real as they are disturbing, and you need to know them.